Okay, well, let's begin. Good evening, colleagues and friends. We're delighted to host you for this evening's program and to come together at such a time as we're in to hopefully expand our capacities for thought and ethical action. Tonight's event is titled The Pleasure of Hating, a critical conversation to the idea of racism as enjoyment. There are 500 of you signed up for this right now, and I know people are still filing in, but you literally maxed out our Zoom license, and we had to shut down registration this afternoon. So clearly there is a hunger and a need for a conversation of this type. So let me begin by describing a bit of the structure of our time together and how we'll be proceeding. I'm going to give just a couple minutes of brief remarks about this inaugural talk and the larger context of the Psychological Humanities and Ethics lecture series. Then I'll introduce our distinguished speakers. Professor Hook will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. Professor George will respond immediately after. And about an hour or so into our time, we have some space for questions and engagement with all of you. So in the chat function, you'll receive some instructions on how to submit those questions, and we'll do our very best to tend to them and relay them to Professors Hook and George. So let's get started. This is the inaugural Psychological Humanities and Ethics lecture at the Lynch School of Education and Human Development here at Boston College. Over the years, we've been incredibly heartened to witness the depth of conversations that take place at the Psychology and the Other conference, which happens every other year. And we decided to establish a larger initiative. So under the title, Psychological Humanities and Ethics, this initiative will be home to ethically rich conversations taking place at the intersection of our fields, in the forms of lectures and workshops, activities, and various programs. The goal of this lecture series is to bring together scholars and clinicians to invite us into meaningful and much needed dialogue. Seeing language play and different forms of wisdom and knowledge interact to enrich our understandings of persons, our relationships to each other, and our experience in this world is an incredibly critical thing at this time. I'll be honest, as a psychologist, I often fear that my field is impoverished in its ability to speak adequately to the existential and ethical dimensions of our lives. So inviting dialogues of this sort is, I hope, an action towards change. We're delighted that Boston College is actually willing to be home for this, and you can be on the lookout for what's coming next. We're excited to see this grow, and we welcome your input and desires as we architect this and bring it to life. So please reach out with thoughts and ideas, and maybe benefactors too. Now to our speakers and conversation at hand. There's a reason why there are 500 and more of you that are coming to this webinar today. We're in desperate need of more substantive and complex ways of understanding racism. This subject is just terribly fraught, and the fault lines are loaded with fear and anger and dissociation. It's hard to even know how to think exactly when one is even talking in this subject matter. But think we must, and listen and learn we must. I speak personally when I share that both Derek and Sheldon have been individuals who have helped me contend and encounter at a deeper level, and I'm honored that they'd give up their time and energies with us tonight. So let me formally introduce them to you. Derek Hook. Derek is a scholar and practitioner of psychoanalysis with expertise in the areas of Lacanian psychoanalysis, post-colonial theory, the work of Frantz Fanon in particular, the psychology of racism and critical social psychology. Derek has taught classes on these subject matters across the globe, from South Africa to the UK to his home institution at present, Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. His writings are prolific and quite well known, and he has several books coming out in the year ahead, including with Sheldon, and that particular volume is Lacan and Race. His grants and awards are too many to mention here. In short, his work has been impactful to many, and we're grateful he's here with us tonight. Sheldon George. Sheldon is a professor of English and scholar of American and African American literature at Simmons University. He teaches courses that span antebellum to contemporary American literature, including Toni Morrison and American literature, modernism and the Harlem Renaissance, 20th century US fiction, and race and gender in psychoanalytic theory. His scholarship focuses heavily on literary and cultural theory, with a particular emphasis on Lacanian psychoanalysis. His recent book, Trauma and Race, a Lacanian study of African American racial identity, was published in 2016, and he has several other texts that have either just come out or that are coming out in the coming year. He received the Dean's Award for Exceptional Teaching in 2010, and the Provost Award for Student-Centeredness in Graduate Teaching in 2018. I often daydream about taking and auditing his classes. So with no further ado, Derek, may I ask us to start into this evening with you?
So thank you everyone for making the effort to be here. It's really something I'm so excited about, to have this opportunity. Thank you, David. Thank you to all colleagues at Boston College and the Lynch School of Education and Development. Thanks to Sheldon as well. So let's begin. Why this slightly counterintuitive title, The Pleasure of Hating? Doesn't seem to make an awful lot of sense, and indeed it does sound very counterintuitive. Hopefully within the next hour or so, we'll be able to make some inroads. We'll be able to see why that title might have something useful to say about racism more generally. We could say that in the history of much psychological theory and continental philosophy, or much of psychology and continental psychoanalysis, we have a proverbial instance of two ships passing in the night. Awful lot of work's done on each side, but hardly ever is there an exchange of ideas. And I think that's what we're going to aim at today. My basic assumption, my basic starting point is to say that those of us who are interested in psychology, who work in psychology, or those of us who are interested in racism and trying to further an interrogation of racism can learn something from Lacanian psychoanalysis and the rather odd notion that Lacanian psychoanalysis asserts, namely that racism can be understood as a kind of theft of enjoyment. So that's what we want to do tonight. We're going to do a little bit of critical work. We're going to explore that idea. We're going to open up various facets of that idea. Hopefully, we'll also have some opportunity to ask some critical questions about this thesis. Let me say right from the outset that it's true, Lacanian psychoanalysis has its limitations, and indeed, hopefully we'll have an opportunity to ask some questions about that. But what our real priority is trying to open up some of these ideas that may help us to rethink various facets of racism, and that may, in many ways, also offer a series of critical thinking points, a critical reformulation. Hopefully, it'll help us interrogate some of the basic assumptions we often have when we start thinking about what racism is, how it works, and what underlies that. And that, I think, would be valuable critical work. Let me also say that rather than be very theory heavy, I'm going to try and lead with examples. And to do that, I've brought my own little private library along. So I'm going to introduce you to some of, it's like a DJ, except that I've read from books rather than play tunes, okay? So we're doing a little bit of Derek's library thing. And last introductory comment is to say that this is very much, I think, absolutely in tune with the project for what the psychological humanities might be. In other words, we're going to look to a discipline outside of psychology that says different things. We're going to use lots of examples. We're going to look at literature, and we're going to try and explore this thesis. So without further ado, we can ask the first question. What is racist enjoyment? We see this term in Lacanian theory time and time again, the notion of enjoyment, or as in French, jouissance. What is jouissance? And what indeed is racist jouissance, racist enjoyment? Again, it sounds like a contradiction in terms. But I think maybe the best way to try and introduce this, here's the first of my examples, is to make reference to a film called This Is England. It's I think it's a 2008 film. The director is Shane Meadows. And in This Is England, which is the story of a young boy who loses his father and is totally rudderless. His father dies in the Falklands War. The kid must be like 10 or 11. He's rudderless. He doesn't know which way to go with his life. And he gets taken under the wing by some skinhead guys. And halfway through the film, they take him off to a British National Party rally. So the BNP, British National Party, is a neo-fascist far-right party. And what we see in this scene is the little kid and his new friends, they go off to this rally. And there's a speaker. The speaker's giving a speech and he's extolling all the virtues and values of what England has been and what a white England can continue to be. but he's also getting into this kind of furious, inflamed state where he's explaining all the ills, all the problems, all the threats. And of course, why this scene is so important is that in this moment, you start to see the audience being aroused, being inflamed, being agitated. Almost in this, you could call it a kind of pseudo-orgasmic quality where they're clearly stimulated, agitated, and basically they seem to be getting off on their hate, getting off on their racism. That's a perfect choice of words here, because that getting off, that inflamed, aroused, transgressive, disturbed bodily state is precisely what we have in mind when we talk about enjoyment in Lacanian theory, or jouissance. That state of a kind of morbid excitation of the body is our first crucial point. That's what we mean when we say the enjoyment of racism. So we could kind of retrospectively go back to our title. Yes, I've called it The Pleasures of Hate. And in so doing, I have borrowed from William Hazlitt, who wrote an essay more than 200 years ago on the same topic. First book, B.J. Derrick, from my library. And we could just nuance that a little bit. We're talking more about the enjoyment of hate, or what you could call the negative pleasure of hate, the agitation, the morbid excitation, this inflamed, impassioned, aroused state, which comes with a mode of inflamed hatred. Now, that's not all we're going to say. There are other ways of thinking about what jouissance is. And part of my agenda here will be to try to demarcate and illustrate those. That's our first example. Immediately, you may be thinking, I don't know. I'm thinking, maybe it's a problematic example. Why so? Well, it seems a slightly problematic example in as much as we've been able to delegate the racism of others. It's skinheads who are racist, not us. Okay, so we could say maybe we need to think of a different example. Let's try again. Second book in Derrick's library, except it says my public library, sorry about that, but it's called The Slap. It's by Christos Tsiolkas. And I'm going to give you this, this quote. This is a great example, I think, because the novel is all about a kind of suburban middle-class set of friends who are, having various dilemmas. And we've got a character who's a good, progressive, liberal-minded character. She's about to get out of a taxi cab. It's in Sydney, I believe, and she's in a bad mood. Here we go. She was usually courteous to taxi drivers. They were invariably immigrant men. And she told herself that in treating them with respect and dignity, she was separating herself from the immense sea of indifferent racists out there. But in this moment, she felt neither courtesy nor respect. To hell with him, she thought sourly. Ignorant pig. She received an illicit thrill from the jolt of hatred. That's it right there. That phrase, an illicit thrill from the jolt of hatred. That's what I want us to think about. Why illicit, we might ask? And that's helpful to ask that question, in as much as in that moment, the illicit thrill is there precisely because the thought, the impulse that she's had stands in such stark contrast to her professed beliefs. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that somehow the fact that she has this thought means that she's fundamentally racist all along. No, the point here is that she is liberal, she is progressive. Those are the values that she aspires to. Those are the values that characterize much of her life. But the notion of jouissance is now starting to get a little bit more complex for us, because what starts to become apparent then is that even though I can be the progressive, good, self-critical scholar, all of those factors, you could say, as it were, make the thrill, the illicit thrill of saying something, thinking something that I shouldn't, all the more voluptuous. So here we get a sense then that enjoyment is typically transgressive. It is engendered precisely by doing what one shouldn't, by contravening what is a kind of moral standard. And there's also, oddly enough, this kind of relish in the moment of the transgression. And for me, I suppose when I was looking at the literature and trying to get a good sense of how this might be easily understood, I was thinking about hate speech and the relish and again, I used that word before, but the voluptuous quality of the hatefulness of hate speech. In other words, to go back to the point we've been trying to say, in those moments, the very aggressiveness of that language contains a certain kind of illicit thrill, a relish, a type of enjoyment, an obscenity, a self-reflexive enjoyment at what one has said. What is our point? And we're building to the end of our first section of our talk. Our point is that you can have liberal, progressive identities and sentiments and understandings and values, and they can exist quite comfortably alongside exactly the transgressive thrills that one gets from being racist. I'm trying to emphasize this point because in much of the psychological literature, this is not something that's easily appreciated, because I think much common sense thinking, both about racism and much common sense psychological theorizing, has a difficulty in keeping these two very contradictory states together. One of the benefits, I'm hoping, from thinking psychoanalytically is we can appreciate the dynamism whereby those two things can exist. And indeed, you could almost say that the more I tend to be the good, liberal, non-racist subject, I also somehow surreptitiously make possible the libidinal gains of the enjoyment for being racist. Let me just add one more point before we move on to our second section. And here I'm much indebted to Todd McGowan, who's made this point perhaps better than me. He's got a lovely critique of notions of implicit racism or implicit bias or unconscious bias. And he says, the problem with those theories, which may seem to be much inspired by psychoanalysis, is that they fundamentally misunderstand something. Racism, he argues, is not fundamentally a problem of knowledge or cognition. Racism, it may be that too, but racism is much more fundamentally a problem of enjoyment, hence our topic tonight. So let's move on. We're building some complexity here. Let's make two crucial qualifications. Number one, often when people hear, oh, you're talking about psychoanalysis, you're talking about unconscious. Well, some of the fantasies and ideas and values that come along with racism presumably are less than fully conscious, but jouissance, enjoyment, is primarily a body state, okay? It's a bodily state of arousal, of agitation, as I've been saying. So we shouldn't think about enjoyment as itself unconscious. The second crucial qualification that we should make here is that when we're talking about jouissance and we're talking about social modes of jouissance, we are also saying that social modes of jouissance are powerfully bonding. They are, if we enjoy together, even if it remains largely unspoken, how we enjoy together is also a very powerful means, it's kind of social glue of holding a community together. And I'm always reminded here of a wonderful quote, kind of sobering quote by Jacqueline Rose. She makes this point. She says, hate is one of our most satisfying passions. And unfortunately, not only is it one of our most satisfying passions, but it far outweighs the libidinal rewards of making way for others or of love. This kind of passion of hate is a kind of bonding factor. Little small anecdotal detail here. I've got a neighbor, a couple of, well, he's not quite a neighbor, a few streets away from me. His bumper sticker simply says, I hate Penn State. And I gotta love him for that. It's like, dude, of all the words in the English language you could have picked to put on your bumper sticker, the identity you want to affirm is that you hate Penn State. Anyways, I don't think we need to explore that further. I think that kind of makes the point about how jouissance can be a mode of bonding. Let's now move to think about our second major subtopic, and that is, how might we understand something about the intersubjectivity of jouissance, the intersubjectivity of enjoyment. And here I take a nice quote from a guy called David Macy, and he offers this. He says, jouissance is not a category of pure subjectivity. It implies a dialectic of possession and enjoyment of and by the other. And I want us to focus a little bit on this dialectic of possession. Or let's put it slightly differently. We're shifting gears a little bit. We focused on jouissance as an impassioned state, a bodily agitation. Now we want to think about what happens when we make attributions of other people's jouissance and when, how we manage our enjoyment and what we think about other people's. So we can say that one way of understanding and approaching this Lacanian idea of racism as the theft of enjoyment is precisely by thinking how enjoyment works as a type of possession. Well, two things we can say right off the bat. Number one, our own enjoyment is not something that we often are hugely comfortable with. It's not something we broadcast. It's not something that we typically own up to. We tend to disavow it. If you see me in an impassioned state of anger and someone says, you're enjoying this moment, I would tend to say, probably not. So we have a tendency to disavow our jouissance, and we also have a tendency to think other people are enjoying. And more than just that, we tend to have the assumption is that other people enjoy more than me and in undeserved ways. Now we can draw a couple of conclusions from this. Let's just, before we do that, let's make one further speculative comment, which draws on psychoanalytic theory. And in this moment, I'm going to quote, sorry, narcissistic moment from myself. Here we go. Most of us feel, if we're kind of neurotic, if we're kind of whatever, normal, most of us feel that we deserve more, that we are owed more enjoyment or more libidinal treasures, that we've had to sacrifice some of them, that we've had to surrender some of those in order to get along with others in the social sphere. As such, we maintain a pre-existing condition of resentment towards enjoying others. As such, the perceived existence of enjoyment already implies a social relationship, one which exists before the other upon whom this stolen enjoyment will come to be projected. Here's the key point. The most rudimentary experience of jouissance implies the role of a culprit, someone who enjoys more than I and who is poised to steal the little enjoyment that I do possess. Or more directly put, my enjoyment typically exists in a negative form, in an already stolen form, and I blame you. I blame you for that. You have a surplus and I have a lack. The relationship of resentment comes first, prior to the other's arrival. Okay, so slightly belabored the point, but what we're trying to suggest here then is, and here's one of those moments, we've already had one where we're trying to do a corrective to how racism is often understood. Todd McGowan helped us make the first one. Racism, more about enjoyment than simply about a cognitive error. Here's our second one. We often, even from a kind of liberal perspective, think about racism as a problem of otherness or a problem of cultural difference. Now, maybe that's the case, but what I've tried to argue here is that neurotic, everyday human subjects already have a predisposition to thinking someone else is enjoying more than me or has somehow got something that I'm deserved. If that's the case, then there's an enjoyment problem that comes before an otherness problem. So there's nothing intrinsically problematic about the racial other, the cultural other, the sexual other, although that's what we will tend to believe and want to believe. The problem is more a question of the jouissance of the perceiver. And of course, we'll develop that. It's not just the jouissance of the perceiver, but the lack that the perceiving racist subject has. So I've got a nice quote from Sheldon here, but just let's recapitulate that point quickly. The general psychoanalytic assumption here would be that I tend to experience my jouissance in a minus sign. It's gone, it's been taken away, I'm deserving of more. And when I see other people enjoying, I tend to have the tendency to think they're enjoying at my expense too much. If that argument sounds a little bit tricky, here's my best example of that. Man and wife, husband and wife are having a fight. He says, yes, actually, I did cheat on you. I was unfaithful. And you know what? I enjoyed it. And in that moment, I'm hoping you get my example. It's kind of like the damage is redoubled. Not only did he cheat, but he enjoyed it. In other words, to reiterate, other people seem to enjoy at my expense. I'm somehow hurt by the enjoyment of others. Okay, so here is my quote from Sheldon. This is Sheldon's book. And this is what Sheldon notes. He says, the other's jouissance or enjoyment is the very core around which otherness articulates itself. And that's what I'm trying to suggest. It's not just otherness per se, that is engendering of prejudice, racism. It's not just otherness per se, it's the attribution that the other is enjoying somewhat, that the other has some libidinal possession that is undeserved, that might be toxic, and that is experienced in a way that detracts from me. Now, of course, many people who are hearing this probably are thinking, well, we've heard some of these ideas before. Some of these ideas already exist in the work of Fanon, okay? And that much is true. Fanon already knew it. But here is the distinctive Lacanian formulation. The Lacanian formulation is one that involves a new concept, the concept object petit a, or what we'll just call object A. This is the Lacanian notion. But let me try and put it in more straightforward terms. The quality that I see in you, that I perceive to be excessive, a surplus, a too much, a disturbing, toxic kind of enjoyment, that quality is not so much to do with you in this theory, rather that quality is a kind of externalization, a kind of displacement, a projection, if you will, of my own lack. So the thing that I perceive myself to be lacking, or the thing that I would quite like for myself, that I feel that I don't have, I perceive in an exaggerated, positivized, surplus quality in the other. That's basically the Lacanian notion. In other words, there's a kind of double distortion. The thing that I feel that I'm lacking is seen in the other in an exaggerated form, as an excessive property. We can see this kind of libidinal logic happening in virtually any basic stereotype. If we had more time, we could play with it and see if it works. Jean-Paul Sartre, who inspires Fanon, also has this idea, or a version of this idea. And he makes the quip, he says, well, isn't it kind of odd that in anti-Semitism, the key stereotypical element that is attributed to the Jewish person is that they like money, or they make money, or they have too much money. We could argue, hey, we're living in a capitalist world. What could be more desirable? And of course, in a whole series of different stereotypical attributions, you could see a similar libidinal logic. We can see it in, for example, the idea that I am a heterosexual homophobic man, and I'm really hung up on the fact that gay men, they're okay and everything, but they're having too much sex, always having sex. And of course, we can see it in the familiar, long-standing, historically obdurate colonial trope, which of course is the one that Fanon focuses on, is that the black male subject particularly is exceedingly problematic because of their sexually rapacious, this is Fanon's language, nature. They are too sexually active, which you could say is probably not a bad way of thinking the concealed lack or desire of the white racist subject who perceives that excess property in the other. Okay, let's move on. We've discussed a bunch of things. We've thought about what we could say is the basic state, bodily arousal, jouissance of the body, okay? We've also started to think about the toxic, threatening attributes that one projects, that one displaces onto various others. We've also made the point that it's not that others are, or cultural difference is itself a problem. It is made more problematic, or it is made problematic by virtue of attributions of enjoyment. That's our little recap. Let's also note then an odd feature that qualifies many of these attributions of jouissance, of the problematic nature. We often find that these attributions of what is problematic about the other seem to coalesce around a sensual feature, a bodily feature, a cultural feature. They seem to have this thickness of culture, this bodiliness, this physicality about them. So let me give you a quote again. My library is slowly being depleted. DJ Derek is running out of records, but we've still got a bit of time. We're going to take a brief quote from Slavoj Žižek, and he gives us a nice, concise way of approaching a lot of what I've been saying. What is at stake in ethnic tensions is always a kind of possession. The other wants to steal our enjoyment. They want to ruin our way of life. And they've got access to some secret, perverse enjoyment. In short, what really gets on our nerves, what really bothers us about the other is the particular way he organizes his enjoyment. The smell of his foods, his noisy songs and dances, his strange manners, his attitudes to work. In the racist perspective, the other is always a workaholic stealing our jobs or an idler living on our labor. There's a jouissance problem here. There's a jouissance problem and the other is to blame for it. And interestingly, in that quote, for Zizek at least, sometimes it's a too much and sometimes it's a too little. Here's another corrective to how we often think about racism. Another corrective, you could say, to our familiar narratives about racism. It's not about bodily difference per se, or maybe bodily difference is a factor. But again, Sheldon's really made the point, and I'm going to find my quote from him. In the US today, says Sheldon George, hatred directed at rap music as a source of enjoyment or jouissance has come to be identified with African Americans more broadly. Contemporary discourse binds difference not simply to the body, but to jouissance. It's a really crucial point because sometimes we make this assumption that it's fundamentally about bodily difference, some kind of objective, seemingly difference, whatever, you know, skin tone, all of this kind of stuff, that is what underlies the frictions. But that's not enough, you could say, because one could then argue, well, why do some cultural differences seem to matter so much more than others? And it's a really insightful point, I think, on Sheldon's behalf, because we'll have some other examples of that. What is problematic is how the other enjoys. And often it can be music or cultural elements precisely of that sort. Okay, let's move on to our penultimate section. We're going to talk briefly about what I've called libidinal treasures. And I like this term because we've done this little map. We've spoken a little bit about racist enjoyment, the pleasures of hating. We've also spoken about possessiveness, libidinal enjoyment as a possession and an attribute that the other is seen to have, a problematic, toxic element that the other is seen to have that threatens me. We should also note, however, that this Lacanian idea of the object A, this je ne sais quoi quality that seems to underlie certain features of my hate or of my love, in this case hate, actually in this case love, also applies to me. So in narratives of racism, there's something problematic about the other and there's something precious about me. There's some libidinal treasure, which is crucial, I think, in narratives of racism. To mobilize a good racist discourse, you could say, you need to be able to highlight the treasure that defines me, my group, my community, my nation, that libidinal treasure that the other is taking away or is about to take away. Now, I figured what we should do here is read a little bit of Tony Blair. Yes, you heard that right. Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister. Unfortunately, the book wasn't at the library, so I'm just going to have to read it. Sorry. But anyways, interestingly enough, in Tony Blair's biography, he has a section when he laments a certain thing that he did. He was very successful in outlawing fox hunting in the UK. He went about doing this, but he totally failed to grasp what would the reaction be of the fox hunting class. He totally failed to grasp the cultural significance, or as we could put it, the degree of enjoyment invested in this practice. This is what he says. The passions aroused by fox hunting were primeval. I completely misunderstood what is at stake. It was a tradition embedded by history and a profound community and set of social ties that was integral to a way of life. In other words, what Tony Blair did was he tried to take a certain mode of enjoyment away, and presumably he paid the price. So what I just want to note here is that when we're thinking about flashpoints of racism, I'll give some examples of that. What often seems to emerge, both in the narrativization of the logic of racism and also often in the kind of whatever spontaneous racist experience, is this sense that someone has taken something or threatening something that is precious to me. Now, I get a little tired sometimes of some of psychoanalytic terminology, but I think this is one of those moments where the notion of castration does actually work. And I looked it up. The dictionary says, well, one of the definitions is to be deprived of power, vitality, or vigor. So what I think happens in these moments, this is psychoanalytic reading obviously, is that some of the flashpoint knee-jerk reactions are precisely articulated around the idea that someone is going to try and take some of my libidinal treasures. Now, of course, this also entails the possibility that you will have a whole variety of cynical politicians who don't even necessarily believe that's true, but they know that this is a potent political form of rhetoric to make people feel that something is being taken away from them. And that thing, let's also be clear, it's not just anything. It's my language, it's my history, it's my culture, it's my way of life, it's my right to bear arms, sorry. It could be any one of those different kinds of things. Okay, that seems to be crucial for this. And let me also then add a little proviso. You can often see this, it's not hard to find in racist kinds of discourse. There's always that pivot. Often it involves vitality, it involves a mode of life, it involves one's children, it involves education, it involves those kinds of absolutely crucial signifiers that if taken away will mean, such as my argument, that I will cease to be. But here's the turn of the screw. It's easy in these kinds of fora to give examples of how that might work in a right-wing political world. But of course, let's also be honest, that would also apply presumably to everybody. So presumably I've also got my castration points, the things that I would have some kind of knee-jerk reaction to. I too have my libidinal treasures. And I think that's important to make mention of. Bringing it back to racism, just briefly, there's a great quote in a James Baldwin essay, the famous little, The Fire Next Time. And it seems to me that in this essay, he does a nice Lacanian thing. Here's the quote. He says, he seems to mobilize this idea of the libidinal treasure or the Lacanian object A. He says, white Americans find it as difficult as white people elsewhere do to divest themselves of the notion that they are in possession of some intrinsic value that Black people need or want. I think the quote stands on its own. Let me give an example of what I'm talking about in the libidinal treasures and why I think, despite that some aspects of this theory may sound a little stylized, a little reductionistic, a little too psychological, why I think this is an important narrative logic and libidinal logic. And in order to do that, I'm going to give you another example. Sorry, it's also from a book of mine. But I mean, I don't have to apologize, right? I'm doing a talk, so it's okay. Right. So some colleagues and I were part of a group of researchers. We called ourselves the Apartheid Archive Project. And the overarching agenda of the project was to collect historical narratives of how people in South Africa in the period of apartheid, like a mixed demographic of people, recollected, remembered moments of racism. So as I was going through all of these examples, we collected a whole bunch of these narratives. And I thought, well, look, dude, you're doing all this like whatever enjoyment, racism thing. Do you think it really works? Let's have a look in some of these examples. And so I also did this thing, which you're supposed to do if you're like a clinician and you're psychoanalytic, you're supposed to say, okay, now something has happened. Why now? Why not earlier? Why did it happen now? What is the specificity of the situation? What immediately preceded it? And this is what I started to find. What was the thing that happens before this racist outburst that is being described in the narratives? I was struck by just how frequently such eruptions of racist anger were the result of a perceived infringement of sorts. Such racist behavior typically followed the breaking of a law of enjoyment. The list of such infringements was as long as it was varied. Black children swimming in a white-only swimming pool. Black families polluting and overcrowding traditionally white tourist spots. Black children driving down the standards of education at formerly white schools. The idea, and this is a direct quote from one of the narratives, that Black should not watch blue movies, pornography. Black should not watch blue movies because it gives them ideas of how to rape a white woman. I think I can rest my case. I'm not saying that this analytical motif, this concept explains everything, but it's certainly a tenacious and reoccurring feature within those narratives. We could say that this persistence and tenacity seems to tell us something about racism, that so many times we see this theme of a kind of stolen treasure, a threatening extraction of sorts. So let's see if we can draw some more conclusions from this. One of the ideas that we should make on this basis is that we have all got some kind of libidinal treasures. And in that respect, okay, it's helpful. So we don't just say, well, it's only other people who've got this problem. Okay, I suppose that's kind of obvious. That being said, I think it's also important to note that if we're thinking psychoanalytically, what I perceive as my libidinal treasure, that thing that's so special about me, presumably there's always a degree of narcissism, always a degree of inflation, always a degree of some kind of fantasy elaboration about what that attribute might be. Also, oddly enough, we are after all doing a counterintuitive thing tonight. Oddly enough, is it not also the case that sometimes we feel a righteous indignation at being robbed, that we revel, that we enjoy precisely the indignation that this precious thing about me is being taken away? And I suppose what I'm wondering is that, is it sometimes the case that the thing that I take to be defining of me is most powerfully realized and experienced precisely when I feel that it's being taken away? Or put differently, might it be that I'm stumbling over myself for the opportunity to complain that someone has stolen this special thing about me, that the more I feel that it's potentially stolen, extracted, the more it somehow exists for me? That may sound a little bit precarious, but I had a moment not so long ago when I was watching Fox News or Fox TV, and it's kind of a silly anecdote, but I think it kind of illustrates the point. There was an anchor who was saying, Alexandria, the Democratic Congresswoman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, had apparently suggested that we need to do more about nutrition. And this guy was saying, she's taking our hamburgers away. She's taking your hamburgers away. And I was kind of like, okay, I'm not so sure she's really taking your hamburgers away. But in that moment, it felt to me that there are sometimes precisely these odd libidinal moments where one kind of contrives a situation where one hopes one can complain that someone is taking something away from oneself, precisely so one can have the libidinal rewards of complaining about it and experiencing it as somehow real, perhaps more real than it was before. Let's give a nice quote to try and illustrate that point. And the Lacanian idea here would be that precisely in those moments when there are certain libidinal treasures which are narcissistically appealing, which are so symbolically important for my identity, and which give me some kind of pleasure, those ideas are presumably a little bit phantasmatic. Yanis Stavrakakis, we're on our second last book, so we're almost there, has a great book called Lacan and the Political, and he makes this point. He's talking about jouissance, enjoyment within the political domain as bonding groups. He says, no matter how much we love our national ways of enjoyment, our national myths of greatness, they are always already premised on a type of lack. Such apparent satisfactions are never enough. There's always something that's missing. There's always a surplus that is missing. Within the national fantasy, this lost can be attributed to the existence of an alien culture or alien people, others. The enjoyment lacking from our national community is being denied to us because they stole it. They are to blame for this theft of enjoyment. What is not realized within such a schema is the fact that we never had it at our disposal in the first place, this supposedly full enjoyment. We never had that enjoyment, or at least in the way we imagine or think or fantasize we had it. We never had the full enjoyment that we accuse the other of having stolen. That's his conclusion. We can make two interesting assertions here. Number one, and many other psychoanalytic theories of racism have already made this point, that makes the racist subject highly dependent precisely on the person they're complaining about, right? Because the attribution that they've stolen something away from me in a way gives it a reality that it may not have had otherwise. The second conclusion that we get from that is not only that there is a dependency of the racist subject on the person they're complaining about, on the group that they complain about. There's also here a sense that, okay, we've made this idea that I kind of sometimes willingly gravitate towards a position of being the victim, but that my projections of greatness, of fantastic whatever, were never really there. And this leads us to a further conclusion. Not only are we then dependent on the person that we blame, but again, maybe our attributions of a lost enjoyment make it possible for us to believe that there was one that we had when maybe we never did. Let's make one further set of points and then I will conclude. This is the last section. I call it the rules of enjoyment. And our second last quote for tonight comes from Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche has this to tell us. He's talking about the genealogy of morals, and he makes this reference to Thomas Aquinas. Maybe you know it. Thomas Aquinas has the view that God-fearing believers will one day have the pleasure of watching the damned suffering in hell. In Aquinas' own words, as cited by Nietzsche, the blessed in the heavenly kingdom will see the torment of the damned so that they may even more thoroughly enjoy their blessedness. Why are we introducing that idea now? In the last few moments of the talk, what I want to suggest then is that it's important to think about how enjoyment is suffused with, intertwined with law. In that example, we see that law in some ways, or morality in some ways, is, you could say, dependent on a certain mode of jouissance. I will enjoy sinful people suffering. This is part of how I am godly. This is how I am moral. We have a dilemma then that in many instances, jouissance supports and extends the law. And of course, this is not a difficult concept to grasp because we could say that the passion for justice very quickly turns into something a little less than honorable. We could say that jouissance supports and extends social norms. We have in any social situation, in any society, a set of unspoken rules of enjoyment defining who can enjoy, who should enjoy, and who shouldn't, and under what circumstances. Brief example, I would read it out, but we're running a bit short on times. The New York Times in 2011 has an article. Article is given the byline, "Partying amid poverty stirs debate in South Africa." Here it goes, extract. Sandton, South Africa. Kenny Kuneni, a former gangster turned businessman, gave what he called the mother of all parties for his 40th birthday. He ate sushi from the belly of a woman who was wearing nothing but black lingerie, while hundreds of guests looked on. As the revelers got tipsy on his liquor, he says he treated the most important amongst them, including President Zuma's stylish spokesman, to $1,000 bottles of Dom Perignon. The opposition leader, Zwelimzimi Vavi, accused Mr. Kuneni of spitting on the faces of the poor and declared that parties where people have gotten rich in such dubious ways and flaunt their wealth turn my stomach. Perhaps my example, the implication is clear. I'm not a big supporter necessarily of Kenny myself. I think there's a lot of lifestyle choices that he could have made differently. I don't think there's some things he could improve upon. But isn't it interesting that if that same set of activities had been conducted by a series of white, high-flying, whatever, South African politicians or businessmen, it wouldn't have been quite so newsworthy. In other words, modes of enjoyment, as they are socially realized, bring with them a tacit set of rules of who should enjoy, in what capacity, and why. What we can then say, and this is one of our further contributions to thinking about how this notion of enjoyment and racism as enjoyment may stretch and challenge us, how we think about racism, is that racism as enjoyment is not merely a psychological factor. Some of what I've said may sound like that, but these kinds of examples suggest that enjoyment undergirds law and public morals, and it takes on a super egoic quality. Got one last example. We could imagine thinking about being the proverbial alien from another planet who comes to do a bit of sociological research on planet Earth. Your question, alien researcher, would be to go into a certain social situation and say, excuse me, what are the rules of enjoyment here? Who's allowed to enjoy in certain ways and who's not allowed to enjoy in those ways? What are the double standards of your rules of enjoyment here? And in what way do they contrast the publicly acceptable social norms of that situation? That'd be a good research project. Let me end then. I could go on, as is probably apparent, but let me end. I know Sheldon might take up some of these points with a brief example, and my library is now finished. The journalist's name is Johann Hari. He's got a book called Chasing the Scream, and it's a book about the war on drugs. Here is what Johann Hari wants to tell us. In his Chasing the Scream, Johann Hari offers a compelling argument that the war on drugs was motivated not so much by the need to uphold law and order, or by any concern with the life and welfare of addicts, but by a far less morally defensible agenda. Here's a quote. The argument we hear today for the drug war are that we must protect teenagers from drugs and prevent addiction. We assume, looking back, that these were the reasons that this war was launched, but they were not. The main reason given for banning drugs, the reason obsessing the men who launched the war, was that various minorities, Blacks, Mexicans, Chinese, were using these chemicals for getting their place and menacing white people. My comment says, the agenda here seems to have been driven not only by fury at the fact that people were indulging in problematic forms of enjoyment, alien and potentially contaminating forms of enjoyment, but that minority groups were forgetting their place. Harry Anslinger, says Johann Hari, was the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and he detested jazz. Quoting Johann Hari, jazz for Anslinger was a mongrel music made up of European, Caribbean, and African echoes, all mating on American shores. To Anslinger, this was musical anarchy, and evidence of a recurrence of the primitive impulses that lurk in Black people waiting to emerge. The lives of jazzmen, he said, reek of filth. My comment, jazz music to Anslinger was inseparable from the evils of alcohol and drug abuse, and his vendetta against narcotics soon became focused on the jazz world. This is a kind of summary of Hari's book, and particularly on subsequently one particular target, Billie Holiday. My observation is, it seems difficult here to avoid concluding that Anslinger was particularly troubled by such other modes of enjoyment, and that the war on drugs was partly motivated precisely by such a hatred of enjoyment. The point then, and I really will conclude now, is that jouissance entwines itself with law. We get jouissance by exerting law, by implementing law, but it's also the case that sometimes laws get written as a result of formations of jouissance. In conclusion then, racism is not, as much psychological theory might have it, an array or simply an array of attitudes and prejudices. It's a set of something more than that. Racism pivots also on a series of symbolic values, on libidinal treasures, which crucially involve a potent moral dimension. This is crucial. This is why I've been trying to highlight the connection between jouissance and law. That jouissance supports law, that law invokes jouissance, and also, in certain instances, that law follows on from modes of jouissance. This idea that racism might involve a potent moral dimension is often overlooked in popular impressions of racism as simple ignorance, as racism as unfounded hate or intolerance. While racism may indeed be all of these things, it also involves a type of indignation, an impetus to blame and to punish. It involves a sense of laws and societal, if racist, norms and ideals that have been violated. Racism is also, at least in part, a moral formation, and it involves the force and the enjoyment of the superego.
Thank you very much, Derek. Sheldon, would you like to take us away for the next little bit?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank David for inviting me and Derek for starting us off in such fine fashion. The title of my talk is Jouissance and the Ahistorical Roots of Hatred in Contemporary America. Now, Derek's provided us with an exceedingly clear description and also vivid examples of jouissance and its functioning. What I would like to do is extend what Derek has discussed by suggesting how jouissance has been tied in a specifically American racial context to hatred of the other. I want to start where Derek started, with two ships. But ships as they're described in the first novel written by an African American. That novel is titled Clotel or the President's Daughter, and it's written by William Wells Brown. In it, Brown describes two ships. One, he says, held the high commission sealed by a spirit divine to establish religious and political liberty for all. This ship, carrying the embryo elements of all that is useful, great, and grand in America, is the Mayflower. But far off in the southeast, on the same day in 1620, says Brown, one beholds a low rakish ship hastening from the tropics, a ship freighted with the elements of unmixed evil and carrying the first cargo of slaves on their way to Jamestown, Virginia. In our American context, I would like to suggest jouissance is deeply rooted in the history of these originary ships, and especially in the American slavery that begins on this day in 1620. But how is jouissance and the pleasure of hating tied to slavery? In his seminar titled The Other Side of Psychoanalysis, Jacques Lacan himself speaks of jouissance, strangely enough, precisely in relation to ships. He notes that at a certain point in history, beginning with some unknown traffic of ships around Genoa or in the Mediterranean Sea or anywhere else, at a certain point in history, says Lacan, capital begins and jouissance became calculable, could be counted, totalized. What I would like to suggest is that slavery and racism make jouissance calculable. I want to show that jouissance is an ahistorical loss that is recovered, or seems to be recovered, through historical modes of enjoyment like racism. So jouissance is incalculable, but it becomes calculated by tying itself to a history of race, to a history of hate. Now again, what is jouissance? Let me give a fairly concise initial answer. Jouissance is lost libido. It is bound to Lacan's famous lack. The relationship between jouissance and lack can be understood in the context of Freud's notion that the subject is polymorphous perverse. That is, that the subject is able to receive pleasure from all object choices and at any physical site on the body. We can think of this polymorphous potentiality as the enjoyment or the jouissance that is abstractly available to the subject. But what happens is that subjectivity itself forecloses this enjoyment. This foreclosure occurs in two ways, through language and through embodiment. And here I'll say that it's here that we see the broad applicability of Lacanian theory to all subjects. We all enter into language, and language grants us subjectivity. It names our identity. But this subjectivity is deprived of all that escapes language. And what escapes language becomes the source of the unconscious and of what Lacan calls the real. This escaped portion of subjectivity creates the psychic dimension of loss or lack. Something is subtracted from the subject, something that Lacan calls being. One way we can think of this being in relation to libido is through sexuality. Though we are polymorphous perverse individuals by nature, we tend to restrict our sexual choices to one sex. Subjectivity, structured through language, grants us self-definitions that limit sexual libido. But there's also a libidinous lack tied to embodiment. The body organizes enjoyment around its gaps, around erogenous zones that concentrate pleasure at specific points where the inside world meets the outside. So the mouth, for example, or the pleasure of seeing, the racial other. So the polymorphous perverse subject comes both to experience pleasure as restricted by the body and also, at least in the subject's fantasies, as recoverable from the outside world. It's here that race comes in, as an external object tied to recovery. The central function of race is to support the fantasy of a recoverable jouissance, of a possible wholeness that evades lack. Race makes jouissance calculable by making it accessible. In slavery, you calculated your jouissance, your sense of having being, or of even being a superior being, through owning slaves. The quantity of slaves you had was a calculable index of your jouissance, your self-completing enjoyment. As capital begins in Lacan's reading, and as slavery comes to be a central form of capitalism in my reading, slave masters calculated their jouissance and measured their racial superiority through the quantity of slaves they owned. Owning slaves made white men and women into proper gentlemen and ladies. Slavery produced a genteel class by supplying workers in the field who made it possible for mistresses to stay in the homes. One moved up in class and secured one's own future and that of one's family through investing in slaves. Slaves were a life insurance policy, a means of passing on one's legacy after one's death, as slaves were gifted to daughters on their birthdays or on the occasion of their weddings. In a time period when women were ceaselessly oppressed by patriarchy, some women found freedom through nuptial contracts enforced by their fathers that made the slaves the women's properties, not the property of their husbands. So slaves granted both white women and white men a sense of being, and even a sense of absolute power. In his autobiography, William Wells Brown tells a relevant story of a white man's power. The story of a man whose clothes were accidentally muddied by a slave who's driving a wagon. Out of pure anger, this man purchases the slave from his owner and then, upon becoming the slave's master, whipped the slave within an inch of death. He bought the slave to whip him and to show the slave and everyone else that he held power, that he was superior, that he lacked nothing and his enjoyment could not be curtailed. What we see in this example is that slaves functioned as what Lacan calls the object A, the fantasy object that, once possessed, indicates the subject lacks nothing. Through owning slaves, whites professed their wholeness. But of course, possessing the other as a fantasy object A was a precarious process. You see, the fantasy object signals that someone has access to jouissance, that someone not only possesses, but also enjoys the object. And since the object is rooted only in fantasy, it's an unstable object that can seem to be possessed by anyone. Lacan describes the A as tied to what he calls jouissance, or jealousy over the jouissance that others seem to access. He identifies this jouissance in a story told by Saint Augustine, a story of a child turning pale with hatred at the sight of a sibling sucking at the mother's breast. The sibling has the A, the fantasy object that seems to grant the sibling complete enjoyment, the very object that the child himself lacks. In this example, the child's lack seems caused by a sort of theft, a deprivation seemingly tied to the sibling possessing what the child needs in order to complete himself. Lacan says that here, jouissance emerges as a substitute form of jouissance. The child has lost access to impossible jouissance, as all subjects do through subjectivity, so that jouissance is gone. But what he finds through jouissance is hatred as a new kind of enjoyment. He gains pleasure through hating the other who has what he lacks, who has stolen what rightfully belongs to him. So here, jouissance, which is not calculable and which is ahistorical, since it's ever lost, jouissance becomes calculable by tying itself to a specific moment in the child's history. This same tying of jouissance to history, I suggest, happened in slavery, which became bound to a jouissance of racism. Lacan's example of jouissance finds its corollary in slavery through Southern breastfeeding practices. It was common practice in the South for white women to use slaves as wet nurses who would breastfeed their children. These slave women would give the aid to the white child. But slavery presented possession of the object A in an odd manner, where white children could grow up to own that slave mother and therefore own the object A she seems to encapsulate. The white child was ever an intruder, stealing the milk that properly belonged to the black child. Here, the black body itself, possessed by the mother, becomes an object source of racial rivalry. And this is something that Toni Morrison picks up on. In her novel Beloved, there's a scene right at the start when Paul D arrives at Setha's home, and Setha is telling Paul D what happened to her in slavery. And after she tells her story, in shock, Paul D says, "Setha, they whipped you while you were pregnant?" And instantly, Setha insists, "Yes, and they took my milk." And her journey from slavery becomes a journey toward her children to give them her milk. They had escaped slavery before she had. So slavery has given rise to contestations over ownership and control of the serviceable black body. This body that was once bought and sold is today choked and killed. Racial rivalry takes on the language of illicit possession of objects, language about welfare queens who steal the government dollar, or blacks who are thugs and thieves. What American racism is about is an effort to not give up the objects of the past that once granted subjective enjoyment. So in 1923, a group of women called the United Daughters of the Confederacy, they were so enamored with the image of the nursing Black mother that they helped transform her into the image of the mammy, and they convinced the Confederate Senate to erect a statue of this mammy in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Now, the House of Representatives voted down the passage of this bill, but the plan itself marks the lingering jouissance tied to race and the slave's body. Not only do we consume the mammy in the form of Aunt Jemima on our pancakes, but we revel in the prowess of the Black body in our popular sports entertainments. The Black body supplies substitute jouissance when it entertains and when it can be submitted to violence, the excess violence of a suffocating knee on a Black man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, the grasping onto, suffocating, and killing of the Black body at the hands of a whiteness whose very being depends upon killing. What slavery has achieved is a historicizing of a historical jouissance. This year marks an anniversary. 400 years ago, the Mayflower gave birth to the nation, but the slave ship also gave birth to a calculable, abiding jouissance rooted in racial hatred. What this trafficking of ships made manifestable is a lost enjoyment, a re-emergent substitute jouissance that makes enjoyment eminently available through not just hating, but also killing the Black other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheldon. Derek, is there anything you'd want to respond to or speak to before we open it up to some of the audience questions? And I encourage the audience, to continue populating questions and in the chat function, and we will get to them as we can. But anything, Derek, you'd want to say?
No, I'm happy to wait for questions.
Okay. Well, we've had quite a few come through, and I know we've got about 10 minutes or so to be able to speak to them a bit. Just looking through the many things that have come in, one thing that I'm seeing in terms of thematics is, I think a lot of people are wanting to imagine if the way you are describing racism as this type of jouissance, if this is taken up more seriously, how might this help transform, or as one person said, eliminate racism as it exists today? What would you want to see taken up in political discourse, in policy reform, in the remaking of this nation, such that it would create the changes that might be possible? I know that's taking this highly nuanced theory and trying to imagine it into our situation right now, but I'm curious if you have thoughts or would want to dialogue on that.
It's like an impossible question, but I'll offer something which is perhaps quite rudimentary, but I think is still important. Even in the most basic introduction to Lacanian theory, there's this notion that the subject is premised on lack. And I think we have a problem because we as a culture aren't particularly keen on engaging lack, particularly our own lack. And if it is the case that by being able to attribute jouissance to others is a way of effectively turning them into others, and if it is the case that racism operates as the theft of enjoyment, which makes us able to believe in our lost greatness, our lost enjoyment that we can recapture, it's going to be very difficult to acclimatize to the idea that maybe the ideals, the myths, the national modes of enjoyment that we've enjoyed, that we've tried to premise our identities on, might not have existed. And maybe that it's more a case of confronting one's own lack than being able to attack, destroy, violate the other. I mean, one of the points that I suppose that I also wanted to make, this sounds a little bit odd, but one of the paradoxes that I think emerges from some of these theories is that often, I was trying to gesture towards this and didn't quite get there. If the racism as theft of enjoyment thesis is accurate or does enable us to do some explanatory work, that means that there's something tremendously gratifying about racism. It gives us the thrills, it gives us the gratifications that come with hate, but it also enables us to continue fantasies of narcissistically inflated subjectivity. That's one of the things that makes it so hard to give up. There's lots of other things one can give up. One can make peace with various different facets of whatever, bodily difference and so on and so forth. But if it means that one's cultural identity is to be premised on lack, I don't know, it's a big challenge, in short.
Another question that's come through is asking if you could say a little bit more about the relationship between the jouissance of racism and the unifying traits that organize sort of a mass psychology, just some of the group think and mass psychology. How does this jouissance theory, I know, Derek, you spoke to this a little bit in your talk, but I'm curious if you could flesh that out a little bit more.
I mean, again, it's so difficult to do much justice to these questions, but let's just put it in straightforward terms, and at a later point, we could add more nuance to it. To put it in as basic terms as possible, you could say nothing bonds a given community more than a shared modality of jouissance. You get this section at the end of Civilization and its Discontents, where Freud has this long account of this kind of ritualized meal, this ritualized enjoyment. And a bit like my colleague down the road with his I Hate Penn State, it's that mode of enjoyment bonds much more even than symbolic ideals. And if that's the case, this is, I suppose, the point I was making earlier, it also is something that's kind of difficult to budge. But I suppose my essential answer there would just be to say that enjoyment brings with it the capacity of a kind of bonding. And it's difficult to break that apart. And you can change many symbolic ideals, but unless one is able to somehow make sense of having to forego a certain degree of imagined enjoyment or a fantasy of one's own wholeness and one's own greatness, then it's going to be difficult to get rid of racism. I suppose that's what I'm saying.
Well, it's a follow-up, Derek and Sheldon. One person would like you to create a script as to how they would sit with someone that they're trying to help understand about their use, the jouissance use. How do you convert a racist using this theory? So we could write that script up for someone later on. I know that'll be a simple 3-point thing that we can provide. Sheldon, anything you would want to add to the mass psych or group think piece?
I'm not sure how to even approach answering that question, but one thing I would say is that in terms of the possibility of grounding an identity on lack, right? Because I think that's the solution here, right? It's, as Derek says, you have to engage your lack. You have to recognize yourself as a subject who lacks and not invest lack in the other. But then how do you get there, right? And what's really useful about psychoanalysis is that, especially from a Lacanian perspective, what the analyst does is bring you to the point of recognizing your own lack. But then how do we translate that at a cultural level? How does that happen socially? How does that happen outside of the one-on-one engagement between the analyst and the patient? I would suggest that in early forms, early renderings of African American identity, what you had was exactly a grounding of identity on lack. You know, Lacan talks about identity, the possibility of sort of traversing a fantasy of wholeness. And once you traverse this fantasy of wholeness, you create an identity ex nihilo. You create an identity out of nothingness. And I would suggest that in slavery, what you had was a situation where African Americans generated an identity out of lack. They were confronted with a situation where they were defined as subjects who lacked. And so the fantasies that, that ground the typical subject, the fantasies of wholeness, could not be as readily sustained in slavery. And what slaves ended up doing was constructing their own fantasy of an internal self, a fantasy of an internal object A that unified them around a notion of jouissance. And I would suggest that they did so through religion. Religion became the thing that allowed them to deal with absence, the thing that allowed them to accept that they lack. But then that changed. Whereas, as Derek was saying, jouissance becomes a way of unifying groups. This soul became a way of unifying African Americans, but eventually the soul got transformed into race. W.E.B. Du Bois's The Soul of Black Folk, it's a racial soul. So something has changed over time, and I don't know how we get back there. I would say one way of changing people's opinions on a mass scale, as opposed to what happens in the in the analyst's office, is at the level of the media. It's at the level of images. It's at the level of the body. It's changing representations of the body and the sort of fullness, the sort of enjoyment that the athlete produces. That seems to be a way of re-signifying the sort of wholeness and the sort of excess enjoyment that Blackness tends to represent in our culture.
Maybe I could just add something to that. Thanks, Sheldon. I suppose the question, I have actually thought of a reasonable, I think, response that hopefully will supplement what Sheldon has said. I sometimes find a little bit inspiring the end of a lecture that Edward Said gave called Freud and the Non-European, which, he's not hugely into psychoanalysis, but he gives it at the Freud Museum, and he's engaging with a Freudian text, Moses and monotheism. But at the end of that text, he has a brief interlude where he talks about what might a cosmopolitan identity be. And of course, he's speaking in part about his own experiences of being a dispossessed Palestinian. And he talks about the difficulties of that. But to cut a long story short, he gives this idea. This is a kind of premise, almost you could say a model, or you could maybe say a non-model of what it might be to have a cosmopolitan identity. And he said the only way that it works actually is that one has to have an identity that's premised on a kind of wounding, premised on a kind of puncturing. And what he means by that is it seems that it's precisely against the necessary anxious state of needing to shore up one's identity, to feel some kind of cultural wholeness, to pull together and have this, whatever you might want to call it, the wholeness of this kind of identity that is me, that gives meaning, that gives me a mirage of jouissance. It's almost as if he's saying the only viable cosmopolitan identity is one which has to take into account there's not going to be necessarily a happy story that makes me feel better about myself. And this, interestingly, is often a useful theme to think about in the kind of critical whiteness literature, because you often, you see these texts and people say, well, I'm white, I feel bad about it. But like, well, how can I still feel a good subject? And I think the Edward Said idea here is that maybe you're missing the point. The point is precisely not to have the palliative of feeling better. The point is precisely not to reach out and hopefully restore some redeeming image of oneself, but to sit in that moment of fragmenting anxiety, hence all the puncturing of the cosmopolitan identity, the woundedness of it, which means that one, instead of having this wholeness of me, my culture, my identity, my values, that you let other stuff in. And that process means, by definition, undergoing anxiety and a sense of subjective group, maybe national dissipation, both of what one feels oneself is as a whole and of what one thinks is one's necessary birthright of enjoyment. And that's why I was sounding a little bit pessimistic earlier, because it's difficult to do that. But there can be moments. And I'll just say one last thing. Sometimes it helps if you've been in different cultural locations, or if you've experienced, I'm obviously white, so I haven't, but if you've experienced what it means to be marginalized in some ways. And I'll just give a brief example that links back to it. When I was a kid, I grew up in Zimbabwe, okay, so this is Southern Africa, and then apartheid South Africa. And I remember things were changing, and I remember the day, I must have been about 4 or 5, and there was a black newsreader. And let's put it mildly, my family wasn't particularly progressive. And this was kind of colonial Africa, basically. And people, like white people, were like, oh my God, how can a black man, because, you know, to read the news, you're supposed to be like this, whatever, ideal. And what was kind of funny about it was that they all thought the world was going to shatter, but it didn't. And I'm not saying that that made them less racist or anything, but those are the kinds of moments that I think are kind of helpful when one has a certain investment in a certain identity, and then one realizes that maybe, for example, once had an African-American president and the world didn't end. Anyway, I think I've said enough, but those are just some thoughts as a way of response.
Well, excellent. We are just about at 8:30, and I know people are going to start dropping off pretty quick. So let me take 30 seconds here at the very end and thank you, Derek and Sheldon, for being in this conversation with us tonight and bringing us into the richness of this dialogue and this important subject. And I'll just say to the audience very quickly that both Derek and Sheldon realize that to do this work, it needs to be done with many more hours and poring over the texts and thinking together. And so they've offered to have a few workshops in the months ahead, looking at Lacan and race in greater detail in much smaller groups. I mean, there were dozens of questions here at the end that we didn't even get a chance to even get close to talking about. So we'll be sending out information. So stay tuned for that in the near future. I'm also just going to quickly thank Muki Manalili, who is my psychology and the other co-chair who did a lot of the work behind the scenes on this, and Lillian Andrade, one of our brilliant graduate students who is here working with us on this, and Caitlin Solano, who did a lot of the infrastructure building for this. So without you, this couldn't have happened. Thank you, everyone, and many blessings in this wacky world we currently live in. Hope to see you in future times. Be well, stay safe.